today's demonstration is finials. Finials for hollow forms, finials for Christmas ornaments, for boxes, whatever. It's all kind of the same procedures. Finials are a spindle turning project. So your grain is going to be running parallel to the bedways. Now, I feel, some people may disagree, finials can be done many different ways. Doesn't necessarily have to be long grain like this. You could take a small blank like this and do a finial side grain like you would a bowl or a platter. But generally, it's a spindle grain running horizontally. I like to break rules, so it makes it a little more interesting. To make a finial, the first thing you need is you need to have some sort of a plan. A finial needs to be thought out. You don't generally want to just throw a piece of wood in there, making a finial for some other piece that you've turned, and just expect, unless you're Cindy Drozda or, Richard Raffin or something like that. You need to kind of plan where certain dimensions and diameters are going to be on the finial. You will need a lathe. You don't need a gigantic 1,000-pound lathe to turn a little toothpick finial, but hey, if that's what you've got. You'll need various tools, spindle turning tools. So a spindle roughing gouge. Where's my camera? So that's the big, heavy U-shaped gouge. Spindle roughing gouge, a parting tool. I use a standard grind spindle gouge, a detail spindle gouge, which is essentially just a little pointier, and then if you have it, a fine detail spindle gouge, which is the same as the detail spindle gouge, just smaller. Each tool performs one or two functions really well. Like the spindle roughing gouge, hence its name, is for roughing out a spindle. You can make gentle curves, beads and coves with these, but it's not really what it's good at. The parting tool is excellent at gouging straight in and parting a piece of wood, but turning details with it, not impossible, but not really what it's meant for. The spindle gouge is great at making better beads and coves, tighter radiuses and things like that, and then even tighter radiuses, and then even really tight radiuses. So each one has what it does really well. On the board over here, I've done a quick hack job of a sketch to just kind of illustrate the different elements of a spindle. And if you kind of think about what I said earlier about when you make a finial, you need to have a plan before you do it. To understand that a little bit better, just try drawing a spindle on a sheet of paper. You can see that is a horrible table leg. But I just wanted to kind of show the different elements that spindles will have that you'll be using to make a finial. So spindle turning is all about beads and coves. That's really all there is. A bead being a bump, a cove being a divot, for layman's terms. This gentle sweep is a cove. It's just longer. This is a bead. Again, just longer. Now there are other types of cuts that you can do, but they're still beads and coves. A V cut is a V, but it's still essentially a cove. Your straight lines are parting tool cuts. Bevel cuts are basically a half bead, just half of the side of a bead, just not round. So everything can be taken down to beads and coves, okay? You'll want either a 4-jaw scroll chuck or some type of drive spur. This is just a simple safety center, so there's no teeth on it so that the wood will slip if you get a catch. I'm going to be showing you, hopefully, 3 different finials today using different methods so you can see there's more than one way to turn these. With your chuck, it's a good idea when you're turning fine, small finials to have what are called pin jaws. And you can see these are very small diameter, small cross section, and longer so that they hold the wood a little bit better. At the end, when we do one of the onion style finials, that's these guys, we'll be doing these just with the chuck, no tailstock support. So having these longer jaws offers more support for that piece of wood. To do fine details, you will want a harder wood with relatively strong grain. So things like oak, not really the best to use, although again, rules are meant to be bent and broken. I've turned oak finials. It's a beautiful wood, lots of color. The grain has a lot of pores to it. Sometimes that can look good. Some of the exotic woods, probably most of the exotic woods, are going to be great for finials, but cost goes up and things like that. So today we're going to be using, this is a piece of cherry for the first finial. I've got some hard maple for the second, and maybe some, I can't remember if this might actually be pink ivory. So maybe. First thing you want to do with the piece of wood is you want to mark center. So I have a handy little center finder. Marking center on both ends. And this is a square piece of wood. I did cut it so that it's equal on all sides. And it's about 3 inches long. So if you're not familiar with these, this line down the center is the exact center. It is not calibrated for the thickness of the pencil ink, so it's always a good idea to mark your line from all 4 corners. And you'll see you've got 4 lines on there, and it kind of approximates the exact center. And you can eyeball it from there. So I'm going to do that on both sides. I'm going to take the point from either my tailstock or my drive spur, and I'm going to dimple that, both sides. So I'm grabbing the piece of wood in my pin jaws with one of the jaws on each side of the flats, and it's loose. Bring my tailstock up, and then I can use that to find the exact center. So that perfectly centers up that piece of wood. As long as I did my center marking correctly, then it should be perfectly centered. Tighten up the chuck, and then I can finish tightening up the tailstock. So I got nice support there. For all of these, I'm going to be using shorty tool rest. This is a 4-inch robust, because obviously we don't need a lot of length on our tool rest here. Give it a spin, make sure nothing is rubbing. Now, we're small, so we want to have a lot of speed. You're going to be somewhere up around 2,000 RPM. The faster you have this spinning and nice sharp tools, the smoother and easier it's going to be to cut. So we're going to start off with our spindle roughing gouge, and this tool, as I said earlier, is really good at knocking off those corners. Really easy to use, and a very versatile tool, which I'll show you here shortly. To use this, we're going to have the handle low, which puts the bevel almost pointing vertically. That will put us in a bevel rubbing position, but hopefully not a cutting action right away. So you'll hear, I'm just rubbing the corners of the wood. I'm not actually even cutting anything. To get the cut to start, I'm going to slowly raise the handle until I see chips coming over the top of the tool, kind of coming down this flute. So that's when I know my cutting edge now is the point of contact. When roughing out a piece of square wood, you always want to start in the wood and work your way out. You never want to come straight into those square corners. You'll get a catch, chip, blow the whole piece apart, catastrophic, the world will end, all that kind of good stuff. So raising the handle and working from the wood out. And as that diameter gets smaller and smaller, you may not be able to see, but I'm having to raise this up each pass to maintain contact with that cutting edge. And we're just looking for round. To test for round, you can just rest your tool on there. It'll be smooth where it's round, and then it wants to jump around where it's not round. Okay? The next way to make a cut with this is you can actually roll this tool one way or the other, and it becomes similar to a parting tool. So and this will allow us to get up close to the chuck. So if I roll on its side and I just plunge straight in, it makes a nice, efficient cut. It does chip out the wood, but we're not really concerned about that at this point. So I can cut like that on the side, or I can rotate back to the middle, and I can cut the whole thing, either way. And I'm just looking to get this round, that's all. All right, so the next step that we're going to do is we need to create some sort of a tenon here on the end. Now this is where you need the details of whatever it is this finial is going to be going into. You need to know what size this tenon is going to be, whether it's going to be threaded for an urn or just a simple plug-in style finial or a sea urchin or various other Christmas ornaments. You need to know what size that is. Now I'm not making this for anything in particular, so I'm just going to pick a random size. Let's say, let's see what we're at now. So we're about 1.5 inches. Let's make that 1 inch. Yeah. So you can use veneers like I do or a caliper. These would be sized to whatever it needs to be. So 1 inch is our number. Next tool, parting tool. The parting tool Very similar to the spindle roughing gouge, we're going to approach our piece of wood with the bevel just rubbing. By raising the handle until you see wood coming over the top, you will begin to start making your cut. Okay? Once I get a little bit of a groove started, then I can come in with my sizing tool, calipers or whatever, and I can rest my arm on the headstock of the lathe and ride those veneers right on there. So as I'm cutting, once those veneers slide over, then I know I have my finished size right there. So there's 1 inch. For this finial, I'd like to have probably about a 1/2 inch of tenon to grab in the chuck. So we'll make another cut. And all I'm doing is just eyeballing that until I've matched up to the previous cut. Nice and straight. Okay? Using my parting tool, I can also put a nice little chamfer on the end just to break that edge. And now my tenon is complete. One thing I stress is make sure that whole thing, it may look straight, make sure you've actually achieved 1 inch the whole way across. There's nothing worse than doing this, turning it around, turning the whole finial, only to take the beautifully finished finial and you go to stick it in the piece and it doesn't fit. Don't ask me how I know that. All right, so the tenon is done. So we're done with our parting tool. Before I turn this around, I'd like to do a little bit of turning here while we're nice and supported and everything's running true and I'm happy with how things look. Because once I turn this around, I won't really have access to this to do any additional cutting or sanding and things like that. So I want to, again, be planning ahead. Think about what I need to do here because this is the only chance I'm going to have. So I would like to put a little bit of a V cut in there. So I'm going to use my detail spindle gouge. I don't want to make this a real sharp edge. But it's a smaller finial, so I need it somewhat delicate. About right there. But I can see that my angle that I've created isn't quite sharp enough. So I need to change my approach a little bit. And what I mean by that is I'm visualizing this curve that we're going to be creating. And this is just a simple curve, like this one. Can you guys see this? Okay. So a little bit different than what the ebony one is, but I am trying to visualize the angle that I've just cut sweeping down into this cove. So I'm looking at the whole piece and kind of approximating that's my trajectory there. Okay? So once I've done that, and I'm happy with that surface, which I'm not. Okay, so we're happy with this. We would sand it if we needed to, but I think we're good right there. So we are ready to turn this around. This shoulder, move my hand, this shoulder right here that is going to mate against, for example, a sea urchin. you can hopefully see that there's a lot of gap going on. So when you're making a finial for a sea urchin, it's a little bit different, but just to illustrate the idea, undercutting this face would make it so that you get a nice, clean, seamless joint against the piece that it's going into, versus an open face, which is going to clearly show that you didn't get it a tight fit, okay? And all of my, yes. So I do undercut the face on my one-piece threaded finials for that exact reason. So when it threads down, you can't see any gaps around the piece. Okay, so we're flipping it around. Same procedures as before. We're going to lightly hold the piece of wood. Bring our tailstock up for support. Get it located on that center. Then we can tighten up our chuck and then bring our tailstock in for support. I don't want to crush this because we don't want to break this edge that we just created. Okay. Back to our spindle roughing gouge. Same thing, working from in the wood to the out. Raising the handle as it gets smaller and smaller so I can maintain contact with the cutting edge. And there we're round. It's a very efficient tool to use. Okay, so from here, the next part of having a plan comes into play. This is where, is anybody familiar with the golden ratio? You guys all have had to have heard of it. Heard of it, okay. So the golden ratio. George talked about this a little bit a couple months ago in his demonstration about form and function and things like that. I won't get into a lot of detail, but look up the golden ratio online. It is a universal rule of how to make things aesthetically pleasing to the human eye. Everything from nature, architecture, wood turning, metalworking, the human face can all be found, this golden ratio can be found in everything. It's basically, in a nutshell, the rule of thirds. So whatever the length of this finial is, if you divide it up into thirds, so 3 equal segments, your details should match up with those thirds, either 1/3 or 2/3. If it does, it is proven over and over that experienced turners, your customers, your family members that know nothing about this will agree that it looks better than if you didn't follow that rule. Even our tool handles, this bead and this cove follow that rule of thirds. I think you would agree that my handmade tool, I did not follow the rule of thirds very well. I just needed a handle. The Robert Sorby handle, if I can hold both of them, definitely has a more pleasing shape to it. It's that simple. It's just what looks good to us. You can also use, this is a homemade golden ratio caliper. So whatever length I make this, point A to point B, point C is 1/3 there, or 2/3 here. I use this when I'm making my hollow forms to help me determine where the largest diameter of the piece should be to help me achieve that golden ratio. It can also be used on our finials. You guys can see that. So you can see I'm probably a little bit off on that bead. That's the onion, that big bead there. Probably needs to be a little bit higher up. So anyways, golden ratio calipers or just simply measuring things. So if we look at this piece, it's kind of hard on small stuff, but so our smallest portion, I'm going to shoot for somewhere right about here. And that should hopefully make this final piece very pleasing to look at. The golden ratio will also come in on your diameters. So this that will seat against my hollow form should be my largest diameter. Ideally, the tip or the top of the finial should be 1/3 of that, or 2/3 of that. And then this diameter, the base of my cove, should be 1/3. Probably going to end up being smaller than 1/3, but let's see how we do. Standard grind bowl gouge. So instead of starting out here at the point, which I think is a common beginner thought, that's where I want the peak, so I need to start from there. But this tool cannot hog off all that material. You need to work up to it. So kind of starting somewhere in the middle, we're going to start that cut. And this also gives you the opportunity to make a lot of practice cuts before you get to that final cove, that final cut where everything has to match up. The flare here at the tip that I'm approaching, all the way down to that smallest diameter. This cut starts off with the tool straight, the flute vertical, and as I get down, I'm raising the handle and turning to create that cove. It's a spindle turning, I feel, is a lot more difficult than bowl turning. I'm not sure why. Spindle turning really has been around longer than bowl turning. So you'd think we'd all be really much better at it. You'll reach a point here where I need to get a little bit more room. So we're going to kind of start taking away some of this wood. To gain some more room over here. I'm going to lose my line. Since I am supported between centers, I don't really need to be too concerned about my turning over on the chuck side weakening the wood, because I've got the tailstock for support. I'm also going to turn this diameter down. Okay. There are some rules to follow in spindle turning, and that is when making a cove, you always have to work from the larger diameter down to the small. You don't generally want to go from a smaller diameter up the sides. You'll create torn grain and things like that. Working down the grain smooths the grain as you're going down. I'm adjusting this size as I go just because I think it's coming out a little bit too big, that flare. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. There's a little something I'm feeling may actually be something in the grain. Oh, there's a little crack. Okay, we can take care of that. It does take a fair amount of concentration on these finials because you're turning so small. And now we're going to do the same thing on the other side, that same cove cut, but it's just a shorter distance, tighter radius. Sometimes it helps to hold your tongue out, so. Okay, so I'm getting a little bit of chatter on this face. So there is something growing there. I think that's creating a little bouncing. Sandpaper is our friend. I'm going to switch to my detail spindle gouge. That's not doing much better. Sometimes you really can just blame it on the wood. But like I said, sandpaper is our friend. So you can see now as I'm turning right up close to these chuck jaws why I wanted to do some of that turning when it was at the tailstock end. It's probably most of us, it's not our favorite thing to be so close to those chuck jaws. And again, don't ask me how I know. I think you could probably see that that's a little bent. I probably hit the chuck jaws with that, I think. So, okay. So that's good. Now we can do some sanding. So I've got 4 levels of sandpaper and some Scotch-Brite. So we'll go through these. I'm going to start with 150. And this is the nice thing about doing these fine detailed finials is sandpaper can really take an inexperienced turner. If you can just get the general shape, sandpaper can really finish it off. And sandpaper is a cutting tool. Some would argue that it is the most important cutting tool for a turner. A pro tip for you, when sanding, and this is for all wood turning, don't ever hold the sandpaper in one place. You always want to be moving the sandpaper around. Holding it in one spot, you know, all this grit on here is a cutting tool. And if you hold this sandpaper in one spot, one revolution, on that second revolution of the piece of wood, it's going to hit that same 100 little pieces and just cause scratches, which are deeper than what you have, and you have to sand more, and it's just a vicious circle of sanding and ruining and sanding and ruining. you also want to be aware of where your sandpaper is. It's very easy for the back side of your sandpaper to be hitting something that you already sanded beautifully. Okay, 220. $400. You can see why I like these Finials. They're relatively easy to turn and easy to sand. It's just one big cove. And then we'll go to 600. Yeah, 600. Let's see how we did. Okay, there's some defects in the wood. That's not my fault. That's Mother Nature. But everything else looks beautiful. I'm gonna hit this flare a little bit more. And for those of you who use white Scotch-Brite, you know the benefits. So white Scotch-Brite, the finest, it's probably finer, but that we can actually buy, is a great final buff. This almost burnishes the surface, and it glosses up just about every wood. Almost looks like there's finish on it right after we're done with this. Yeah, I have not changed. Actually, I sped it up for sanding. So I'm sanding faster than I was turning. I find, the general rule is you slow down to sand, but I find have better results, higher speed on something so small. You can actually, going back to sanding being your friend, if you've not done such a good job in the turning and you're sanding at that high speed, you can actually see the shape changing and in real time and oh yeah, I like that a little bit better. So, okay, so we are all finished, sanded, and buffed. Now we can create our slash cut at the top. Now normally at home, I have a old Craftsman belt disc sander. I've got a 150 grit belt on, so I just sand this angle in, but I didn't want to bring that, so we're going to cut this one. And I have my trusty coping saw. So we'll lock our spindle maybe. There we go. And I'm just going to kind of find an angle that I like. Yeah, I use the coping saw on everything that I'm turning, when I'm cutting off that last little bit. Now we want to be, plus it's also gentle. You can maybe see this kind of flexing as I'm cutting. And then this solves the problem of the little indentation from our live center. I would not want to do this without tailstock support, and I have tried to do this in my bandsaw, and your fingers are just way too close. Almost. There we go. Okay. I probably won't spend Almost got them out. Just trying to get the saw marks out. So now I just want to kind of break that rough edge a little bit. Now the next one we're going to make is basically the same thing, but it's going to be a two-part finial. So more like this. This comes in handy when you have, for example, sea urchins. You can see all of my sea urchin ornaments here are two-piece finials. So sea urchins are an interesting thing. Obviously it's nature. So the hole in them is not round to begin with. You have to make the holes round. Sometimes they come out a lot bigger than what you think. If you don't have a big enough piece of material, a two-part finial really comes in handy. So you can take and make a disc out of a flat board, and then a skinny little finial out of, say, something like a pencil blank, pen blank, whatever you want to call it. So it also adds another design element, another color of wood, whatever you want to call it. But just adds a little bit more interest to the piece. So let's go with this mystery wood that maybe pink ivory, we're not sure. Now, if you're interested in sea urchin ornaments, Cindy Drozda is the woman. She is the master of finials, and yes, in fact, the onion finials that we'll be ending with, I learned how to do those with my phone on my headstock and just step by step, pause it, do that cut, play, and she just teaches you exactly how to do it. It's basically what I'm showing you now. But these are the mandrels that you would be using. These would obviously be covered with sandpaper, glued on or stuck on with double stick tape. You size the hole. This will be in your lathe, spinning. You size the hole by sanding away at the natural hole until you get it to a specific size. I've turned this, I think this is 1.125". So once that sandpaper goes all the way in, I know that hole is round and 1.125". And then the same thing for the bottom one, but it's smaller, so you have another mandrel for that. After that, then on sea urchins, because you've got all these bumps and stuff, there's a secondary mandrel that's a 45 degree that you'll come in and you'll chamfer that, and that sands all of those bumps and lumps down so that when your finial matches, or when your finial goes in here, it sits nice and flat and tight. Okay? But Cindy Drozda, check her out. She'll go through all of that. This is just a demo on finial. Yeah, actually you can buy them from her. All of mine I got down in Sanibel, Florida. There's shell shops everywhere, and I think even the biggest one is like $5. I think Cindy sells them for like 15 or so a piece. So
You think that shop's on the other side of the state now?
I think so, yeah. We haven't been there in a couple years now, so. All right, same as before. I've marked my centers and I put a little dimple in there. We're going to do this one without the chuck.
What do you do for the chuck marks on the one that you did first?
Yeah, so this is, keep in mind, this is just about the finial, not about the fit into whatever you're doing. But as I said, when you make that tenon, you would be threading at that point or however you want it to fit into your piece, size-wise. Now, the chuck jaw marks, if you're making something where you're going to see those, you would obviously have to figure out a way to smooth those out afterwards. If you're doing a sea urchin and that's being glued inside, doesn't matter. They can be as horrible looking as you want. So most of the time, I'm threading mine. So I'm going to true that up. And then I make a female spigot out of some waste wood that I chuck up, and then I screw that blank into that. And that's how I hold it then for all the turning. So it preserves my threads. I don't generally make straight tenons anymore. So
Do you use a jam chuck if
you could do a jam chuck. There's various ways, again, check on YouTube and stuff, for holding a finished finial so that you can turn that tenon to look better if need be. Or make a two-part finial like we're about to do. And then that tenon gets glued into something so nobody's ever going to see it. Okay? Safety center. So very similar to before. We're going to rough it out. Always starting in the wood and working out. Just until you get it round, and then it doesn't matter. Standard grind spindle gouge. And somebody had asked earlier about my grind angle. So again, I follow Cindy Drozda's method for doing these finials. Cindy Drozda is a proponent of the 40-40 grind. Hopefully you guys saw my demo here, I think last year, on the 40-40 grind for bowl turning. So same thing for spindle grinding. It's a 40-degree angle. So the bevel angle is ground to 40 degrees, so I don't have to change anything on my grinding setup. 40 degrees, these are all freehand ground. My spindle roughing gouge is the same 40-degree angle. So it's sitting right on the grinding tool support, and I'm just rotating it across the wheel, 40 degrees. Hopefully square across the front. The spindle gouge is 40 degrees and swept side to side. So when you're doing that grind, you do have to also rotate. The goal is to have the flute flat when you've achieved your side sweep. Roll it back to top dead center, and then roll it to the flute edge is flat. The detail spindle gouge, same thing, 40 degrees. It's just I'm taking the sweep further to the side to create those swept back wings and a much more pointy tip. So this allows me to get in on the beads and the coves in tighter radii. I've also ground the heel off. So my bevel is only about 1/8 of an inch or so long. So it kind of gets that heel out of the way, which allows me to get in even tighter into beads and coves. The fine detail gouge is exactly the same, it's just smaller. And I've also shortened up the bevel even shorter, again, to be able to get in tighter. Beyond that, then you're getting into special spindle tools. Cindy makes a bunch of tools, a vortex tool, which is just a ridiculously pointy tool for really getting in deep. Other pro turners have things. Your skew. Everybody's afraid of the skew. So this is a phenomenal tool. Can do everything that I've already done in the right hands. So, and those are not these. Yeah. Okay, so standard grind spindle gouge. Now, we don't have to turn this around at all. We're doing this all in one setup. So we want to kind of approximate about right there. Close to that is going to be where our smallest diameter is. This is what I was saying earlier about planning out. So that's my tenon. How did I do that one? Oh. I'll have a little kind of a chamfer angle there. So yeah, that's going to need to be a little bit more up there. I just want to establish this tenon so I kind of know exactly where I'm turning to. Okay, I've got the general shape that I want. Now, I don't want to make this one flat. I've got my tenon turn. I might go a little bit smaller on that. Yeah, let's go. So just like before. We're going to plunge in. Until those calipers slide over. Now I want to create a little bit of a lift off of whatever this is going to go on. So things always look better when they're on a pedestal. Even your finials. The urn or the sea urchin, whatever you're turning, is your pedestal. So one way that I like to kind of lift the finial up off is to create either a V-cut, half of a V-cut, a chamfer, or a little bit of a radius from this flare down to the tenon. So kind of what I have on the two-piece finial we have over there. So I'm going to take my small gouge. And that high pitch noise you hear is because that finial is flexing as we're turning it. Much better. It is amazing. George and I were talking about this before everything started, about just one little cut can totally change it. Maybe not for the better, hopefully for the better. Okay, I'm happy with that. So same sanding procedures. Keeping my sandpaper moving. I'm kind of giving this a little finger support here so I can push a little bit harder with the Scotch-Brite.
Put a little wax on this Scotch-Brite?
What's that?
You put some wax right on the Scotch-Brite?
Nope, nothing at all, just the plain Scotch-Brite.
Okay.
Thin parting tool. Now you'll notice I did not do my slash cut on this. It's pink ivory, so I'm gonna try to salvage this one. But let's turn the cap. So just a block of wood, centers marked on each end. We'll turn this round. That's why it's a safety center. Such a professional. All right, now I'm going to put a tenon on the end. Same thing as before. This is where we want to size this tenon for whatever it's going into. Hopefully you guys notice I'm talking less because it's kind of the same stuff we've already done. So I would sand this at that point. It's good enough for what we're doing right now. Now we'll switch back to our chuck. Grabbing it loosely. Tailstock up to center everything up. Tighten up our jaws. Tighten up the tailstock a little bit. So I'm trying to create just a simple dome-shaped finial, sort of like the polka dot one that I have there. You can see as I'm making this cut, there's a lot of things happening. I'm starting off with the flute vertical, cutting, and I'm rotating the handle and raising it so that I can follow around that curve. So kind of like three things happening all at the same time. Now we can get tailstock out of the way. And this is all still the standard grind spindle gouge. I had a little catch there. you're probably noticing my posture. Is not the best, because this is an area that I struggle with. I am not very ambidextrous, so I turn everything right-handed, which makes me have to pinch up like this to get around. Our member Denny Watson had told me at some point, I was doing a demo, and he said to me, he's like, "You can't turn with your left hand, can you?" And I said, "No, I cannot." He's like, "You need to practice that." Because that would obviously put me over here with much more room. So we all have things to work on. All right. So I made that 10 1/4 of an inch. So I got a 1/4 inch brad point. I don't need to be super deep, but that should be good. And with that done, we can now proceed to sanding. Again. Okay, there's our cap. Make sure. There we go. Now, some variations on this. I have done, I don't think I have one here. Yeah. Instead of the slash cut at the top, what also looks nice is just a slight dome surface. Obviously, to do that, before we turn the cove, tailstock out of the way, we would cut that. So you'd need to be chucked. Or you could, after this is glued, you could turn it as a complete finial like this. We're going to try to knock out one more. Same as always, marking our center. Both ends. This is hard maple. Little center point. Holding this one in the chuck. Again, tighten it loosely. Bring your center up. That centers up your piece of wood. Tighten everything up. We are good to go. Spindle roughing gouge. Working from the wood out. Create our tenon. Now on this one it's a taller finial, so we need a little bit more tenon length. So we're going to go for maybe 3/4 of an inch or so. Parting tool. And I'm just visually matching up to get that whole 10 in the same diameter. Detail spindle gouge. Same as I did on the last one, I'm going to create a little chamfer on this side. Now for your sea urchin, this chamfer needs to be all the way down to the tenon. But if it's a hollow form or a box, it really doesn't matter. You probably do want a little bit of a shoulder for it to sit flat on the other piece. So we'll plan on that we're making it for a box. Let's turn a little bit on the other side. Sand, sand, sand. Oh, it's actually pretty good. Okay. Tailstock out of the way. If you guys are having any trouble with flipping pieces around like this and getting them to run true. So you guys probably know that I'm a machinist. It irritates me to no end when I've spent all this time making something perfect and I flip it around and it's going all over the place. For years, that plagued me. And I finally realized it wasn't me, it's the chuck. So I used cheap Technitool chucks for years. Finally invested in a Vic Mark chuck. Spend the money, guys. That chuck is so precisely made, your piece will run true every time. So, good tools, spend the money. You can see I'm kind of working the tool, the spindle roughing gouge back and forth. And as I do that, I'm slowly turning the flute in the direction that I'm cutting. Then back. So this is an onion finial. Kind of sort of looks like an onion. So this is, again, planning things out. You want to make sure that you have certain elements in certain spots. Again, rules are meant to be broken and bent and all that, so it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but this is the common onion finial. All beads and coves, just like we've been doing. So we want our bulge of the onion to be closer in the bottom 1/3 area. Tapered down to a fine diameter. Some wood turners make most of this straight before they get to the taper. I kind of try to make it one long taper, which puts the smallest diameter right down here by the tip, the flare, if you want to call it. But again, bend the rules, try different things, see what works. So since I know I've got a lot of material, this is my largest diameter. Everything else is smaller than that. I can get rid of some of this while I'm nice and supported between centers, but we're going to be getting rid of the tailstock shortly. I don't want to get rid of too much material because you need that stiffness to get down to those tiny diameters. So we'll continue with the spindle roughing gouge. Somewhere in that general size should be good. Standard grind spindle gouge. Everything from now on is going to be lighter cuts. And the trick to turning these long finials, if you want to call it a trick, is to work in small sections at a time. 1/2 inch wide or so. Completely finish that section, possibly even sanded, before you move on to the next 1/2 inch, and then the next 1/2 inch, and the next 1/2 inch. So you leave as much wood diameter as possible to support all this tiny stuff 6 inches out from the chuck. So the first thing we want to do is just work this down to our point. Make sure we get rid of that dimple from the center. Detail gouge. I got to remember what I'm trying to do. That is called that's called a catch. So now, unfortunately, I'm not running true. So what we're going to do is move down a little bit so that I can do a little bit of support with my fingers. All I can say is thank God Tom isn't here. Don't anybody tell him, Pete knocked a piece out of the lathe. Semi-pro turner screws up. And my fingers here, I'm not really pulling. I'm just kind of 1/4 pound of pressure. Basically, if I don't hear any of that chattering noise, that's enough pressure. Now, that's 1/2 cove. Now on the back side, I want to create 1/2 bead. So, finally, the skew. The pointy point of the skew comes in, and I want to be about right there. And I'm just creating a V. Down to about the diameter that I want my bead to finish to. Fine detail spindle gouge. Gotta make myself a little bit of room here. This is where some of those specialty tools can really come in handy, getting into these fine details. So now I'm going to take this next section and turn it down to the same matching diameter as the larger portion of my bottom element. And then back to the skew. And the goal is the diameter, curve, and width of this first half bead, I want to match it as exactly as possible going the other direction. Okay, so now to me, that's kind of the hardest part, is getting that kind of set right. So now we can work on the next portion. Also, if your fingers that you're using to support your piece are getting hot, it's probably a sign that you're putting too much pressure on the workpiece. So right here is my smallest diameter, except for that point, but that doesn't really count. And what I'm trying to do is just turn this in such a fashion that I've just got this gentle taper and I don't have any kind of lumps and bumps. And the rest, sandpaper is our friend. I'm starting to get close to where that onion is going to be. So you can see I'm starting to kind of try to find that shape. We're going to reduce this quite a bit, but I want to at least kind of get us in the ballpark. And you can push it somewhat. You know, we absolutely cannot come back out here to the tip and do any turning. We'll snap it. But you can kind of feather a little bit. The wood will tell you what it can take and what it can't take. The top side of the onion, the bead is a longer, more drawn out bead, and on the bottom of the bead, it's a much tighter curve, kind of almost an egg shape. Okay, so at that point, I want to do some sanding while I've got still some good support. Get a nice crisp edge down in between those two beads, but it is what it is. Now my point is very pointy. We don't want you to be able to stab somebody with it. We'll just round that off a little bit. Remember that tip of don't hold your sandpaper in one spot for too long. See, now we talked earlier about that golden ratio, and I can tell that onion it's just too big in diameter. Now, in the world of spindle turning, again, general guidelines and things like that. You can see this V-cut flare at the base of the onion. There is some general things that if you look at columns all throughout history that were turned or carved and things like that, they have these certain elements, and it serves to kind of break up the eye line. Sometimes you want nice flowing curves. Sometimes it can be better to force the eye to stop, and it almost creates a full curve on the bottom of the onion. So it almost makes it look like the onion is setting on this piece here. It just adds a design element, a visual bit of interest. So this side of the V-cut mates up with our base V bead, if you will, in a nice long cove. One more cut. One more cut. Okay. A little clunky, but you guys get the idea. So now I can finish with my 150. And I don't know if you can see this, but how flexible this has become. And it's honestly not even that thin. My goal was to get it done without snapping it, so I didn't want to go too crazy. Sandpaper just fixes so much. Definitely make sure you support when you're out here on the end. And this is what I was saying about earlier about be aware of where your sandpaper is. You don't want this to come around and hit everything that you've already finished. You know, when you're practicing this demo in your head, this sanding part goes a lot quicker. As I'm practicing, I'll be like, now you want to make this cut, turn, turn, turn. Now you want to sand, 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 sand. And it's, wow, that came out really good. Like this sharp detail here and that sharp detail there, I find that I'm obviously I've got the sandpaper wrapped around my finger, and instead of trying to follow like this, I'm coming at an angle with it, so I can kind of see that sandpaper, and I'm watching the sanding line with the paper slowly work up that arch. And as soon as I see the dust from the sanding meet that point, I stop. Because if you go too far, then you're going to start rounding things over. Yeah, it's tough. Oh, I guess that's it. So I'm kind of pinching or using both hands with the Scotch-Brite so that I can really get some pressure in there to kind of burnish it. I'm trying to feel some heat. Then I know I'm getting the level of buff that I want. Not perfect, but pretty darn pretty.
I know it's late, but I'd like to make a short comment on top of Pete's marvelous demonstration. When you're making a finial for a particular box or something you're making, I find it difficult to scratch turn the exact finial that I want to aesthetically match the piece that I'm making. So what I do in my spare time, whatever that is, I make a bunch of different finials, tall ones, short ones, different designs, fat ones, whatever, and I store them in a compartmented plastic box. Then if I have a box that I'm making, I can go to that box, pull out several, and try them. Find one that I like, or modify slightly, and then copy it. Or if it's the wrong species of wood, I can make an identical finial in a different species of wood to match the box. Makes it a whole lot easier, and you get a much better aesthetically pleasing final project.
Okay, so crash course in finials, in easy ones and a hard one. So thank you, everybody.